My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Celeste Wagner is an assistant professor at the College of Journalism and Communications at the University of Florida. Facundo Suenzo, a doctoral student at Northwestern University and the coordinator of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Celeste in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter, our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Facundo will tell us more about Celeste's research and career. Then Celeste will present her work, and after that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen. You can enter them at any point in time. When Celeste finishes her presentation, Facundo will moderate them. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Facundo, the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute honor for me to introduce my dearest friend and admired scholar, Professor Celeste Wagner, and to co-moderate the last presentation of the year of the virtual seminar series. Professor Wagner is an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism, College of Journalism and Communications at the University of Florida in the United States. Maria Celeste Wagner obtained a Ph.D. in communication from the Annenberg School for Communication, University of Pennsylvania. Before that, a master in communication from the same institution, and a licenciatura en comunicación from Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina. Professor Wagner uses qualitative, quantitative, and comparative methods to study media perception and influence around political and social issues, especially in relation to intersecting gender inequalities in the Americas. She has authored several journal articles and conference peer review papers. She's currently working with Virginia Mitchelstein, Pablo Boczkowski, and Facundo Suenzo on a book manuscript, The Pattern of Distrust, Misinformation, and Context of Generalized Skepticism, and in contract with MIT Press. As part of her professional service to the academic community, Professor Wagner is part of the organizing committee of the Media and Communication in Global Identities Conference at the International Communication Association, and co-coordinator of the Gender Economy, Poverty, and Health Working Group at the Latin American Interdisciplinary Gender Network, a joint initiative by the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies at Yale University, the Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios de Género at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and the UNAM Boston Center for Mexican Studies. Among the awards and scholarship, Professor Wagner has been a doctoral fellow at the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and has just been awarded the top student paper from the International Intercultural Communication Division at the National Communication Association. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Maria Celeste Wagner. Celeste, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Facu, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with all of you. I'm going to start sharing my screen, so please do tell me if there's something that you cannot see or hear me well. I trust that you will let me know, but now I see you minimized, so just open up your mic if there's something that you wanna tell me. So thank you so much to everyone who has joined. I know it's December 1st already. I know that you're all very busy wherever you are in the world. So I'm very appreciative of your time today. And it is a real honor for me and I'm so delighted to be joining this seminar. It's such a wonderful seminar for Latinx and Latin America and Media and Communication Scholarship. I started joining and attending these seminars 2 years ago already when I started working on my dissertation, and I got so much inspiration from all of these seminars, the podcast. It was something very foundational and important in my own scholarship. So it's just being able to present with you now the analysis of my dissertation, case studies. It's really a true honor. So thank you so much, Pablo, Facundo, everyone behind the scenes at the center for the invitation and for your time organizing this seminar. So I'm going to present an analysis based on my dissertation, Comparative and Mixed Method Studies, which I've titled Feminism, Communication and Social Change in the Americas, a comparative analysis of the Argentina of Ni Una Menos and the US of Me Too. So what motivated this research? In Argentina, after a series of femicides that received a lot of national attention, in June 2015, a group of journalists, activists, feminist scholars, and members of different social movements organized a massive demonstration in front of the Congress under the motto Ni Una Menos, which could be translated as not one woman less, demanding a list of actions from the government. The Ni Una Menos movement became very soon a very powerful regional movement and led to several political, social, and also media-related transformations in Argentine society and also in the region too. A couple of years later, as you might already be familiar with, at the end of 2017 in the United States, we saw the uprise of the Me Too movement. So both movements received high level of media coverage, and its implications were discussed widely in mainstream media, in social media, and across civic society. So given the centrality of media and social media in these processes, I wanted to understand how was society in these two different contexts responding to this coverage and to feminist activism as well. Could ultimately this media coverage and social discussion across society promote gender equality? So one of the central questions that guides this research is how are feminist and general publics responding to this media coverage of sexual and gender-based violence, interpersonal violence, different forms of violence? We can talk about the terms because they are important, but I will call it gender and sexual-based violence in two of the countries where some of the major anti-violence movements emerged in recent years. Secondly, a main interest that guides this work is, do certain people care more about what happens to certain identities than to others? So in particular, in this project, I asked a second question, whether do victims or survivors' identities in terms of perceived racialization and perceived class impact public opinion differently? Do people care differently about what happens to different identities? So I initially became interested in comparing these two cases, Argentina and the US in the Americas, mainly because of these two major movements, but also because of my own positionality as an Argentinian living in the US and experiencing these two moments in a way that was also personal to me. But I also think that these are two countries that have many similarities, meaningful similarities, especially when we think about intersecting gender inequalities, despite common notions about American exceptionalism. So for instance, the prevalence of sexual, interpersonal, and gender-based violence and how it's typically represented in the media, in mainstream media, similar institutional histories since colonization. especially similar patterns of economic migration, along with the experiences of slavery and the oppression of indigenous groups that have been associated with nation-building processes in both countries, where whiteness has been put at the forefront as the ideal body of the citizenry. So despite some obvious differences in terms of economic development, language, culture, I also argue that there are three main differences of interest for this study that present challenges and could eventually lead to different outcomes, different findings. And especially these are challenges when doing comparative work around communication and inequality in these two countries. One is the historical predominance of the categories of race and ethnicity as the main categories of social difference in the US society, and also the predominance of social class as the main category of difference in Argentina. Also, Argentina's feminist movement has been categorized and considered by different scholars on activism as an organized feminist social movement grounded in a tradition of human rights activism, which is also grounded in the experience of the military dictatorships, the last military dictatorship in Argentina. And today we see some of its leaders have conquered leadership roles in government, have advocated for new legislation, like the recently legalization of abortion. And even though undoubtedly US feminism and US scholarship, feminist scholarship and US feminism have been pioneers for gender rights and especially women's rights in the Western world, the Me Too, many argue, did not develop as a social movement in the same way that the Ni Una Menos did in Argentina. So I wanted to understand the potential of this moment in these two countries to promote gender equality. Can this moment of feminist activism and so much conversation in the media around these issues, could it lead to society embracing gender equality frameworks to think about violence? So to understand this, I conducted interviews with feminist activists in both countries to understand how they see communication for gender equality, what they think about the role of communication promoting in its ability to promote social change, and also how they challenge and intervene themselves mainstream communication around violence. Secondly, I conducted cross-country survey experiments where I wanted to understand if diverse audiences in both countries were reacting differently to news coverage of specifically sexual harassment, depending on who was the identity of the victim survivor being part of the news, specifically in terms of racialization and class. And finally, I conducted a set of interviews with a portion of the survey respondents in both countries. And the goal was to understand some of the quantitative findings that I found on the surveys, but also to explore how diverse audiences in these two countries, in terms of region, age, gender, ideology, racialization, income, were reacting to feminist activism and also to social change around communication. So in both the design and the analysis of these studies, I faced many challenges comparing issues of inequality in these two countries, especially issues about race and ethnicity and class. And why are there challenges for comparative research on race and ethnicity in the Americas in particular? Specifically because race and ethnicity have had very different sociological trajectories in these two countries, which leads to the fact that people talk about these issues very differently in each context. So there's generally a lack of common language. So let me talk a little bit about what is the language around race and ethnicity, around Latinidad in the US context. As Mayer says, Latino, the term Latino refers to a pan-ethnic term, a multicultural identity group with diverse connections to Latin America or different parts of the world, but inherently very diverse in many regards. However, others like Arlene Davila show that despite this diversity, Latinos in the US have what she calls a putative homogeneity in terms of class, in terms of origin, politics, religion, and also race, what she calls mestizos or brown. So mestizo, which is a colonial term that the Spanish used to refer to the racial mixture between white colonizers and indigenous people, mostly white men colonizers and indigenous women, has been used to refer to the cultural hybridity of the group. As Gloria Anzaldúa develops in the New Mestiza, this idea of being indigenous in Mexico and being Mexican in the US, this pluralistic mode of existence, this cultural hybridity. So this is a little bit of how we understand ideas around Latinidad in the US context, specifically feminist Latino scholars, how they conceive it. What happens in Argentina? First, we have to talk a little bit more about Latin America. So in Latin America, mestizaje ideologies around racial mixture, have been very foundational and very important in nation building processes. So in general, these nation building processes around mestizaje argued that as a result of racial mixture, race was eventually going to be devoid of any cultural social meaning because society was going to lead to a unified melting pot in which race was not going to matter. So as a consequence, race in many countries in Latin America has been made invisible as a social category. And for example, in many countries, it's not even measured in the census, or it's inappropriate to measure it in survey research, for instance. In Argentina, however, these nation building processes around mestizaje was slightly different. In particular, because it suggested that racial mixture was going to lead to a whitening process. So this led to an idea of Argentina as a white nation. But many argue that this is problematic or that this is a myth because it essentially erases the existence of racialized individuals, of indigenous groups in Argentina, as well as their fight for recognition, such as the group Identidad Marrón or Brown Identity, who has many initiatives to fight for recognition, and some of the pictures that I included are from some of those initiatives. So essentially, racial difference and racism in Argentina, of course, are very prevalent and they exist, but mestizaje ideologies, what they did is that racial difference and racism have been absorbed by the language of class, by the language of geography, and also of culture. This is what sociology around race and class shows in this context. So in my own work, because of these challenges that I faced in the design and analysis of my research around these issues, I proposed the term racialized ethnicity to account for the intersection of race and ethnicity in the lived experience of racialization in the Americas, which I think can help us make comparisons too. For instance, a term like this can allow us to analytically differentiate and analyze the experiences of racialized or brown or individuals from indigenous descent, mixed indigenous descent in different countries in the Americas, and also Anglo whites or whites from European descent and Latino whites in different countries, and Latin and Anglo Afro-descendants. So it's this notion that in the lived experience, and this is something informed by my interviews, in the lived experience of subjects in Latin America, race and ethnicity are two categories that are indivisible. So I talk about racialized ethnicity. So let me tell you more about my case studies and the findings. In the first study with feminist actors, feminist activists, I conducted 52 interviews with feminists in both countries. The interviews were diverse in many aspects, as you can see in the slide, but one of the main differences was that in Argentina, they typically belong to social organizations or to branches of left-wing political parties, or sometimes to feminist organizations, but not in a salaried way. And in the US, they were usually professional workers, feminist experts in NGOs or government agencies, rape crisis centers. So there were different professional orientations. So what did I find in this first case study? There were many similarities in terms of how feminist actors in the two countries were perceiving how the media covers these issues and how society also responds to them. So in terms of the opinions about mainstream media representing issues of violence, they agree in both countries that how the media talk about these issues is very consequential for society writ large and also for victim survivors themselves, which was something interesting because many of these actors are working on the ground to fight and support victim survivors and to advocate for legislation, different initiatives. And they still think that mainstream media representations are very consequential. They both perceive too that the media does not cover the structural roots of gender-based violence, of sexist violence, and continue to represent ideas of good versus bad victims. And that there is an invisibility of certain identities who experience violence, especially non-binary or trans individuals, and also in terms of the LGBT community in general. Still, they do perceive some recent improvements that they attribute in a large part to feminist activism. And in terms of how they intervene the media, how they challenge these media representations and change it, they also did many different initiatives. So for instance, one of the things that in both countries it was very important was to establish personal and good relationships with local journalists or specific journalists in mainstream media. That was something that they spent a lot of time on and a lot of efforts, because that was a way of really trying to include feminist perspectives in mainstream media. They also routinely do what Gillian Baez calls talking back against the media, these ideas of challenging and complaining and reacting, resisting bad coverage, basically sexist coverage, victim blaming coverage. And they try to hold the media accountable for these things. And in doing all these things, feminists challenged in both countries and in different ways how the media constructs notions of objectivity. And this was slightly different because in Argentina, feminist actors didn't really have an expectation that the media should or even can be objective or neutral or unbiased. So when they were feminist communicators themselves, they often didn't even consider objectivity as something that they were aspiring to do. So that is how it took place in Argentina. But in the US, many of these feminist actors, they would frequently critique how notions of objectivity in liberal media traditions were re-victimizing, that the media constructs notions of objectivity and in a way that is asking too much of victims and survivors, and that in a way that ends up being really re-victimizing for many of them. And now let's focus a little bit more just on the differences. So in terms of how they thought about themselves as actors, in Argentina, they perceived themselves as political actors, as activists. But in the US, they thought of themselves more as feminist experts. So this led to different relationships with the media. Argentine ones thought, for example, of themselves as almost spies infiltrated. They would talk about being infiltrated in different mainstream media organizations. And the US interviewees thought of themselves as expert media sources. And they wanted, and they did many initiatives to try to have their perspectives included in the media. Also, as a consequence, Argentinian feminist actors use social media very differently as an activist platform, sometimes posting things collectively to reduce chances of individual retaliation, either from their employers or depending on where they lived in the country. But in the US, the use of social media was more professional and through the organizations, at least that's what they refer to the most. In the US, feminists also would frequently say that they were very worried about the impact that a polarized media coverage and a media focus on high-profile cases, mostly around celebrities and around politicians, they were worried how this could impact audiences, that might make audiences overlearn certain patterns that are not accurate. For instance, that litigations are very common, that predators are always super predators, and that if there's one victim, there has to be too many, and different things. That they were worried that they would overlearn these patterns. In Argentina, feminists frequently said that they adapted their language depending on communication style, depending on their audience. Their goal was to be very strategic and persuasive. So they call this, someone called it a strategic pedagogy of patience, which many times they said they were exhausted about doing. In the US, feminist actors adopted a more analytical and rigorous understanding of gender-based violence, interpersonal violence, sexual violence, which was more technical. And it was very important for them to use these different terminologies the right way, because they consider that language matters, communication matters. And a big part of their work was training the media in embracing and using language in a correct way. In terms of financial means, the US interviewees were supported by a larger NGO complex, by the structure of grants. And Argentine feminists usually did this as an activism on the side, as voluntary based. So they would often suffer from different hardships, but they still created their own media, which was very particularly radio shows, and specifically in rural communities. So let's talk about my second case study now. In this study, what I was trying to analyze was whether audiences in both countries care differently about what happens to people with different identities, women with different racial and class backgrounds, at least that they are perceived like this. So I constructed news stories about an alleged local case of workplace harassment in which a female worker was accusing a male coworker of harassing her at the workplace for years. Even though in all the interviews with feminist actors and with survey respondents, we discussed issues of interpersonal, domestic, sexual, gender-based violence, usually depending on the terms they use themselves. In this experiment, I only focused on sexual harassment because it is an instance of violence, I consider it violence, where we can more easily see societal biases in how people respond to this. In other words, we would expect that in an extreme case, let's say the case of a femicide, a trans femicide, when there's such an extreme form of violence, we would expect that society in general would be in agreement on how to perceive this situation. But in a case of sexual harassment, many people see sexual harassment as a gray case where it's harder to know what happened. So this is a case where we can see the biases at least more easily. So participants read the exact same news story, but were randomly assigned to reading this story as affecting different identities, the ones that you can see on the screen, either a high-income racialized woman, a high-income white woman, a low-income racialized woman, or a low-income white woman. The sample in Argentina had a quota for region because I could not include a quota for race or ethnicity because, again, it's not measured. So survey companies did not have that information from their pool of participants. And in the US, because of the main focus of my work, half of the respondents were non-Latinx whites and half were Latinos of any race. So some identified as white Latinos, Afro-Latinos, or with different connections to different nationalities. And in Argentina, because race, again, is not usually measured, the survey company could not provide anything. So I ended up measuring race and ethnicity myself using local terms. And also I asked participants whether they had felt discriminated due to their color of their skin as a proxy of racialization. Because again, people are not used to having the race or ethnic backgrounds measured. So I wanted to have multiple forms of trying to get a sense of racialization. So this was the stimuli material that I created for Argentina. Each participant was randomly assigned to reading only one of these articles. I manipulated socioeconomic status of the survivor victim using different references to her employment status, also her attire, and references to her income in the news story. To manipulate the perceived racialized ethnicity, due to contextual differences that I've been talking about, I avoided using any racial signifiers through the language in the texts. So I used racialized names in each country, which I pre-tested first, and photos from the Chicago Faces database of women who self-identified as white and Latina, respectively, and had also been perceived as either white or Latina by a sample of respondents before. So after reading each one of these articles, participants responded to the outcomes, which were trying to measure their attitudes towards sexual harassment. So in the US, participants could opt into responding to the questionnaire in English, which this was the material, but also in Spanish, because a sample of my participants might have preferred to use Spanish. It was only a small part, but some people did read the survey in Spanish. So how was the survey procedure? First, participants responded to some questions about their demographics. Then they were randomly assigned to reading one of these 5 stories that I showed you before. And then they had to respond to a series of questions, ones that measured their level of victim blaming, how much they were victim blaming the protagonists of these news stories, how severe they thought sexual harassment is in society. If they thought that sexual harassment occurs in the first place because of cultural aspects, an idea of what we could understand as rape culture. Like if you think that our culture has something to do, is at least responsible for things like this to happen in the first place, and also how much they were willing to participate in initiatives to fight sexual harassment or to support initiatives that fight sexual harassment and gender-based violence in general. Then manipulation checks were included, which were successful. And at the end, they were invited to leave their contact information if they were interested in participating at a later interview, which many did. So what did I find in these survey experiments? One main finding is that in general, regardless of what people read, what story they read, Argentinian respondents shared more progressive attitudes about sexual harassment than US participants. So in general, less victim blaming, consider sexual harassment as more severe, thought that cultural factors help explain why violence happens, and also expressed more support to solutions. However, it's important to remember that the US sample was diverse in terms of gender, age, ideology, region, income, but it only included non-Latinx white respondents and Latino Hispanic respondents who identify with different races, but it's not representative of the whole US population. So when we look at the role of racialized ethnicity in Argentina, and we pay attention specifically at the interaction between the respondents' racialized ethnicity and the victims, survivors' racialized ethnicity, we see the following. So I'm going to call your attention to the first figure, where we see that people who perceive themselves as white or from European descent only in Argentina, all the yellow whiskers, they blamed less the racialized victim, which is on the left of the figure, than the white victim on the right. So in other words, white respondents in Argentina victim blamed more the white victim survivor, which is something that I did not expect, and I'm going to talk more about later. What happens in the US with racialized ethnicity? So in general, we see a tendency of Latinos of any race, the green whiskers, to support victim survivors more than non-Latinx white respondents. In other words, white respondents in the US had less progressive attitudes towards sexual harassment in general. So this generally counters the stereotype that of especially strong machismo, sexism in the Latino community. What happens with socioeconomic status in Argentina? Here we see in the x-axis how people from lower, middle, or high socioeconomic status respond to different stories, to the different stories you've seen. On the right, the high-income respondents, we see that they victim blame more a low-income victim survivor, which is in green, than the high socioeconomic status one, which is in yellow. So this shows evidence of classism, higher income people discriminating a victim survivor of a lower socioeconomic status. What happens with income in the United States? In the first figure, we see that upper income participants, which are in yellow, when they read about the high socioeconomic status woman in the story being harassed, which is in the middle of each figure, they blamed her more. High income participants blamed more the high income victim than lower or middle income participants. So in other words, high income respondents were harsher with the higher income victim survivor. Similarly, on the second figure, we see that when the victim survivor is high in socioeconomic status, upper income respondents in yellow, they think that sexual harassment is less severe, is less serious of an issue than lower or middle income respondents do. Again, high income people penalizing more the high income victim. So what are some of the preliminary conclusions of this? What happens in Argentina? As we were talking about before, in many Latin American countries, because of ideologies of mestizaje or racial mixture, there is this idea that there is no racism, that there's only classism. But what we see in Argentina, it's not that race doesn't matter, but it does in an unexpected way. White respondents do less victim blaming to a racialized woman. So this could be due to different reasons. One, it could be a paternalistic positionality or a white saviorism positionality from white respondents. It could also be that the feminist movement in Argentina has permeated in society in a way that white respondents acknowledge their privilege and that acknowledge that racialized groups are more oppressed, and therefore they end up being more supportive. Also, I find in Argentina discrimination due to classism, which is consistent with studies on classism in the country. In the US, we see something a bit different. Non-Latinx white participants, compared to Latinos, had generally less progressive views about sexual harassment. So this finding about racism is unfortunately not surprising, and it goes in line with feminist scholarship, Latina studies on the discrimination and hypersexualization of Latinas and other women of color in this context. This also counters the stereotypical idea about the Latino community being too machista or sexist compared to other groups. It would also be interesting to understand if this Latinx solidarity is something particular to gender-related issues, or it's something that speaks about different specific cultural values among the Latinx diaspora, so that we might see this solidarity, this Latinx solidarity, across different issues as well. Finally, in the US, we find that when the woman harassed was high in income, upper income respondents blamed her more and considered sexual harassment as less severe than other income groups. So this could be a classist positionality, but differently from Argentina, one that punishes that a woman from their same high status is coming out with a story that might be seen as a vulnerability. So all of these issues I explored in my third study with interviews with survey respondents. So in study 3, I interviewed a diverse subset of these survey respondents. I specifically wanted a diverse sample in terms of gender, age, ideology, socioeconomic status, educational attainment, racialization, and also region. And the main goal was to explore causal mechanisms that could explain the quantitative findings, and also to analyze how audiences, to explore how they are responding to feminist activism and to the communication of violence in each country. So as you can see, the samples were diverse, although the US one was more highly educated, which is consistent with national data, and also older on average. So what were some of the similarities in how citizens, ordinary citizens, view communication about gender violence in both countries? So in both countries, people perceive that how society talk about these issues has changed, and that a part of that is the result of feminist activism. Whether they support it or not, they perceive this. They also perceive that there is more media coverage of these issues in recent years, and that there are certain identities that continue to be neglected, excluded, or marginalized. There were references to victim blaming tropes. People reproduce victim blaming tropes, mainly the prejudice that women lie sometimes too, when they say that something has happened to them, to obtain economic compensations, and that low-income women specifically are less believed because they are more likely to lie as they need money the most. This was a trope that was present in both countries, which is profoundly classist. So interestingly, in interviewees' discourse, there was an entanglement of class and race in how people talked about classism and racism, which I will talk about in a minute. What about some of the main differences in how the survey respondents, these ordinary citizens, audiences were saying? So while in Argentina, there was more expressed support for the feminist movement, especially the Ni Una Menos movement, in the US, there was more of a sense of a backlash against the Me Too, especially among men and conservatives, which perceived it was a witch hunt. But also women said that they didn't feel that the Me Too movement spoke to their experiences. They felt it was something that sometimes they consumed as a scandal, as a Hollywood scandals. In Argentina, they refer to the fact that the media cover cases of normal people, they would say, as something that led to more empathy and concern. They would often say, I feel this could happen to me, because these were stories not about celebrities or politicians, but ordinary citizens. They also perceived in Argentina a low polarization in how the media covers these issues. In general, they perceive the media is very polarized, but when it comes to the coverage of gender-based violence, they didn't perceive that it was very polarized. In the US, this was not the case. People perceived that a focus on high-profile cases, politicians, celebrities, made them feel very distanced from these issues and to consume them as scandals, as I was saying. Some felt that this coverage was very re-victimizing, especially when it focused on the litigation processes, and they felt that they could discourage people to come forward. Some women even told me that they wouldn't come forward with their own stories for the fear of having to go through something similar to what they were seeing in the media. In terms of victim blaming and prejudice, in Argentina, they tended to more often refer to issues of class, as I was expecting, and race was more prevalent in the US. And finally, there were two proxies of credibility that US participants used that were very interesting. One is that if there are many women coming forward, then the story must be true. And if it's a more recent accusation, or an accusation of something that happened more recently, then it's also more likely to be true. Otherwise, if these two things didn't meet the criteria, it might be false. So let me delve a little bit deeper into what I was mentioning about the intertwining of race and class in both countries. In Argentina, it was indeed hard for participants to engage with the language of race, even among those who identified as racialized themselves in the survey. Often they would say that the prejudice that victim survivors experience is due to class, not race. They would also intertwine classism and racism constantly, like Jerónimo, for example, who is identified as racialized himself, who said, "I see a lot of racism," and exemplified it talking about lower class girls, so moved to classism, but also ended up exemplifying that by saying how they are discriminated against using racial slurs. They would also often respond to questions about racialization in Argentina as a foreignizing and otherizing category, even when they themselves identify as racialized. But they did not talk about these issues as something that was relevant to them, even when we would directly be talking about these issues. They talked about immigrant women from other countries, or they labeled this as an indigenous issue, but not something that is part of widespread Argentine society. In the US, it was also more common that they intertwined, it was very common that they intertwined issues of racism and classism, usually connecting whiteness with wealth. So for example, Marisa said, the US white people feel more entitled to say their story or to be validated in the public sphere. Rich people, power, people who are higher on the social scale feel more entitled to be believed. Often in the US, they also face the problem of not being able to think of examples of certain cases. So for instance, Sebastian, a racialized Latino, when asked about issues of believability of victims of sexual harassment, he said, I think if a white woman that has money behind her comes forward, her words are amplified. And when I asked him, what about if it's a woman of color? He said, he thought for a moment, and then he said, I guess I can't talk about this because I haven't seen the instance where the prominent wealthy woman of color is coming forward and all of a sudden she's getting the same treatment like a prominent white person would. So this inability to think about certain intersectional identities because they are invisible in the media. So to conclude, I want to conclude by presenting a part of a working framework to understand what are some of the factors in communication for gender equality that seem to lead audiences to embrace more gender equality frameworks to think of sexual and gender violence. So many individuals in Argentina expressed to have changed their minds about different gender-related issues thanks to feminist activism. And this was really not the case in the US. It could be that when feminists approach communication in a more malleable way, in a more flexible way, or what the Argentinian interviewees did as a pedagogy of patience, this becomes more persuasive. It becomes something that society writ large feels it's easier to understand or it's more approachable. So Roshan proposed a theory to understand how and when societies see cultural change. And I argue that Argentine feminism might have become what he calls a critical community, which are typically more effective in promoting cultural change in society. And US feminism could be seen now as what Roshan calls an epistemic community, a community of knowledge, which is usually successful for advocacy and building coalitions, but sometimes faces more challenges producing widespread cultural change. Also, interviews with ordinary citizens in the US confirmed many of the fears that feminist activists had in the country. People in the US indeed appear to have overlearned patterns that are not representative of most cases, such as the need to have numerous victims for a story to be taken seriously, or for something to, an accusation to have to be very recent for it to be taken seriously. Moreover, a focus on high-profile cases and their litigation processes on this idea of how men are taken down created more of a backlash and discouraged women to come forward. It would appear then that when a media coverage focuses too much on cases that impact celebrities, politicians, people that in general society feels that are very far from their own realities, it might not very conducive to cultural change. But on the contrary, when media coverage focuses on people like me, what interviewee said, ordinary citizens, people might feel more empathy and revisit their own practices because they feel it's more personal. In the US, experts and general publics perceived that the media coverage of gender-based violence was polarized, especially for cases involving politicians like Andrew Cuomo, Joe Biden, Trump. But also they perceived clear ideological alignments of different networks, like CNN does this, Fox News does that. In Argentina, they also perceived the media as highly polarized in general, but not with the reporting of gender-based violence, especially femicides. Probably because of that, probably because when there's a focus on femicides as the main issue of gender-based violence, then it is harder for the media to really have a polarizing framework. So the analysis of the interviews with ordinary citizens suggests that a polarized coverage of gender-based violence might hinder citizens' adoption of a gender equality framework to think about this problem. And finally, despite the divergent quantitative findings in the two countries, I also found that in interviews, both in the US and in Argentina, people actually shared similar views about certain victim-blaming tropes. For instance, the idea, the classist trope that lower-income women lie because they want to get some economic compensation out of it. It was also interesting to see that even when class as a social category was more prevalent in spoken discourse in Argentina and race was more prevalent in the US, people were conflating class and race in a way that they were seeing them as almost inseparable categories in the daily life. And they were referring to similar experiences of prejudice. So the intertwining between race and class in this spoken discourse is really not surprising, in the sense that in both contexts, it has been communities of color and people from indigenous descent, those who have been historically disenfranchised and suffer economic inequalities. So together, these findings suggest that audiences' responses to communication of gender equality and to feminist activism is really not linear. It's crossed by identity level variables that operate differently in each context, but also it depends on cultural level variables and also country level factors. So I'm really convinced that it is through comparisons that we can understand what is distinct about each context. And I also think that it's important to try to understand what are the commonalities, the continuities and discontinuities between racism and classism in both contexts, and that mixed methodologies are a good way of understanding complex and sometimes even contradicting social phenomena. Still, this research has many limitations, and it is very important that we start inquiring more in this research on not only how society perceived violence against, in terms of gender-based violence against women, but also against different minorities, which is something that sometimes people even didn't talk about. So to conclude, I hope that this work can help us better understand how our feminist publics trying to transform media and communication practices, and also how diverse audiences are responding to feminism and to the existing media coverage. Hopefully, this will allow us to better understand media and communication practices and interpretations that can help promote or hinder gender equality frameworks to think about violence. So, muchas gracias. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Celeste. This was incredible. It's always a pleasure listening to you. So thank you very much. I will start with one question, and then we'll move forward to the audience questions, which are in the Q&A button. If you have any question, please enter them. I will try to moderate them. But Celeste, I have one question regarding that. To what extent do you think that the bill for the abortion in Argentina had helped to in some way, like, organize the feminist movement and explain part of what you're seeing around like the organization, the systematization of practices, but also how people perceive the same feminist movement? Because I remember any like other works that you have conducted on that, especially a work you presented in Meso a couple of years ago about the backlash that the abortion had on how people perceive feminist movement, even when the Ni Una Menos flag. So that's my first question about how do you see like the abortion, like having the bill for abortion in Argentina had helped or not, or had hinged how people react to feminist movement?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much for asking that. As a matter of fact, so if responding from the side of how feminist actors in Argentina were seeing this, they saw the movement. It started against femicides, mostly against women, cis women, and that was the Ni Una Menos. But they saw the continuation of the feminist movement, fighting for the right of abortion as something that was a natural continuity, because they see it as gender rights. They see it as human rights, both, the fight for violence and the fight for abortion. So from their perspective, there was a continuity that definitely, as you were suggesting, it led them to better organization, and especially to have closer organization with political parties, with political organizing, and also, to enter mainstream politics in Argentina. But it's interesting how society actually saw this very differently. They thought abortion clearly, was a more polarizing issue, and people did not see, in general, audiences did not see these two things just from a human rights perspectives, gender rights. They many saw them as profoundly different things. So many were very supportive of Ni Una Menos, and of course they were anti-femicides. But then when it comes to people's rights over their own bodies, it became more complicated. We have to also understand it's a Catholic society. So a lot of the complaints against feminism, many people referred to them as, when they started, the abortion, they radicalized too much. That's when, with the Ni Una Menos, I'm very supportive. With the campaign for abortion, I don't know, some of these feminists are too crazy, right? That was very common for people. So because my focus was on issues of violence, that was not present, but it was something that's very important. And as you said, my research on abortion in Argentina shows that polarization even more.
Yeah, thank you very much, Celeste. We have one question from Sofia Jaime from the audience. They said, I understand how we can benefit from the term racialized ethnicity in the Argentine case, but what about the US case, given that people in the US are used to the racial categories?
Yes, and thank you for this question, because this is very important in the sense that what I've learned in my study is that the way people refer to their own racialization, is very context dependent. And also it is very important in my own work not to impose scholarly categories to how people should experience their own identities. So when I talk about racialized ethnicity, I could clarify that this is more of a scholarly concept, a concept that it is useful for me to understand experiences, specifically to differentiate, because if we talk just about Latinidad or Latinos, we are in one way or another ignoring racial differences. And it is very different to be Latino, a white Latino, a Latino, Afro-descendant, a mixed race Latino. Regardless of how you identify yourself, society, the experiences of discrimination, of racism are going to be very different. So for me to account for both things is to, account for the cultural, linguistic, historical, religious similarities that many Latinos might have, but also accounting that the racialization is very different. And that is very impactful, especially in experiences of discrimination. So it's more of a scholarly category, but that I think it's important so that we don't include in the same groups, at least from a scholarly perspective, people who actually might have very different experiences with classism, with racism, and how society perceives them.
We have another question from Maciel. She asked, what theory or framework are you using for this study? I might have missed that information.
Thank you, Maciel. No, you did not miss that. I had to cut a bunch of my slides to make it in 40 minutes. But, you know, I use mainly 3 frameworks for this research. One is feminist scholarship, and also specifically feminist media studies and Latina media studies that have studied for a long time how gender is represented in the media, and specifically how Latinas are racialized and represented in the media. Also, work that is more related to media effects, that has studied how different news frames or how different identities that are included in the media impact public opinion differently. So this is more quantitative research from media effects perspectives, but also work that has studied, you know, the impact of race and class in news media. And finally, you know, a lot of my work is based on things that I did talk more about, which is in the sociology of race and class in these 2 contexts, studies on mestizaje in Latin America, and also studies on Latinidad and cultural citizenship in Latino studies in the US.
Mariana Sanchez asks, amazing, congratulations. I have a question. To what extent do you think that the analysis in Argentina can be exported to other countries in Latin America, like Mexico? Why do you think that it's so difficult to organize feminist groups throughout Latam?
I'm thinking about the second one. To organize, you mean feminist activism, to organize collective action? I think actually we might not see very evident, you know, collective action sometimes in the form of, you know, like the Encuentro Nacional de Mujeres in Argentina happening, you know, across different countries. But I do think that there is many of the moments in which feminist activism was able to achieve certain things, and we can think about abortion now. The legalization of abortion in Argentina led to some other countries in the region to start debating abortion more. And it has an impact in how legislators across the region think about this. And also, you know, for instance, Argentina with the gender identity law that allowed people to choose their own gender identity in their own national documents. That's also sparked a conversation in the region around gender identity and people's right to choose their gender identity in official documents. So I think that sometimes it's hard to see, you know, the impact of these things, but I do see regional, how there's regional impact when something happens in a country. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any communication between feminist activism in the US and in Latin America, which I think it's a huge problem, especially now in the US, when issues around abortion are seeing a backlash. And there could be so much learned in how feminist activists in Argentina and in other countries have conquered abortion in recent years.
Great. We have 2 more questions. We'll probably be a little bit over time. So thank you, the audience, for being with us. We have one more question from Maya Sanchez Ramos. She wonders if there is, in the Spanish context of La Manada gang rape assault, has Argentina had a concrete case to boost Ni Una Menos?
Yes, there was a concrete case that led to Ni Una Menos. It was the last, how do you say, the last drop in the glass. I don't know if that's a translation to English, but there was definitely one case that was an enough. Society said enough. And that's when in June 2015, the demonstration that was organized was after the femicide of a teenager. She was 14, 15 years old. She was murdered by her partner, her boyfriend. She was pregnant and he confessed. So that was a moment. There were 2 specific femicides that led to the uprising. Yes.
And one more question from Elisabetta Ferrari. Celeste, this is fantastic. I'm very curious about the idea of the pedagogy of patience mentioned by your interviewee. Could you say more about that? I'm thinking in particular about how it could be a trap for feminist activists, asking them to do a lot of labor and box them into gender expectations. But I can also see it as a very powerful way of conceptualizing public-facing work. Any thoughts?
Thank you so much, Betty, for this question. It's very important. I actually love this idea, and I'm thinking of it. This pedagogy of patience, they would mention it, for instance, many of these feminist activists, they were feminist communicators. So they worked in mainstream media, and they also have their own feminist media. So they would say, when I'm working at this mainstream radio show, you know, at 10 a.m. national show, and I have to sit there with my colleague who is saying things that I'm dying inside, but I know the people who are listening to us. And I'm thinking of the man who is, you know, the cab driver who is in the city listening to this radio show. And I see this as an opportunity to maybe have some influence. So she said, if I start talking about patriarchy, or if I start talking about concepts that feel very alienating for people, I lose my opportunity to make a change. So they would say that, yes, it is very gendered, as you were saying. They would say that they would engage in conversations like, oh, I see your point, but maybe can you think about this thing? And like, imagine the situation. Imagine if you were found. So it's almost like infantilizing some of their male communicators in this mainstream shows, but they would see that as an opportunity to influence little by little. And they said, when you are too radicalized, they don't even invite you. They don't hire you. They don't invite you. So you have to be constantly moderate to be included. And they did that sacrifice, but they would oftentimes say, I am exhausted of doing this. I just want to go and yell everything that I think. But they would say, in my feminist radio show, we say everything, that we talk about heteronormativity, we talk about heterosexism, we talk about patriarchy without having to explain things. And there was a second part to the question that I think I have missed, but I don't see it now. Let me see.
Yes, but it says, but it also can see it as a powerful way of conceptualizing. Yes.
Yes, I think it can be a trap, and some of them are absolutely exhausted. But when analyzing my interviews, you know, in the US, many times US interviewees would say, oh, you know, feminists, they talk about this and that. I don't even know what they're talking about. So I think that it is a trap, but as you say, also it's a very powerful way to be persuasive, to really promote feminism in society.
All right, and on that note, thank you very, very much, Celeste, for a spectacular seminar. The last one of 2022, as Facu said, and the first one by a former graduate student affiliate, now a colleague. And faculty affiliate will have one of each more of those in the winter and spring lineup. Stay tuned. So great way to both closing the year and kicking off a new sort of phase of the center seminar. Thank you, Facundo, for excellent moderation. Thank you to all the audience members for staying with us through the end. I wish each and every one of you a joyful, healthy, and peaceful holiday season, and we will resume the very first Thursday of January of 2023 with a great seminar by Raquel Moreira from Southwestern University in the US. Have a wonderful rest of your day, week, and month. Bye now.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.